involve the community. They have 700 volunteers. And I think Betsy has the same flavor, and they're exciting, they're innovative, sometimes controversial, but they're always worth watching. And that's an evening of entertainment.
At first glance, Zoom looked like every other kids show from the late 90s. It was colorful, chaotic, and seemingly harmless. But years later, many viewers began noticing things that had been hiding in plain sight all along. It wasn't even a secret message, but a simple idea that made Zoom unlike almost anything else on television. Once you see it, it's impossible to watch the show the same way again. So what exactly was Zoom doing that set it apart from almost every other show of its time? And why did it disappear the moment it stopped? Join us as we unravel what Zoom was really doing differently. Reviving a dead show. Many people know Zoom, but few people know that the show wasn't really a new idea in 1999. WGBH in Boston had already made the show once before, from 1972 to 1978, and then let it die. Bringing back a canceled kids show almost 30 years later was no easy task by any standard. By the late 1990s, kids' TV was dominated by Nickelodeon, Disney, and Cartoon Network. Those were the big channels. They had games, prizes, and big budgets. PBS, on the other hand, didn't work that way. It ran on public money, and every dollar had to be explained to financiers like the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and the National Science Foundation. So instead of just dusting off the old show and putting it back on air, PBS took its time, thinking of ways to make it even better than the previous version. They first filmed the pilot, with a brand new cast in 1995, years before the show ever went on air. Even the pilot didn't show up on TV right away. It went around to funders for 2 whole years before it finally aired in November 1997. The fact that they spent 2 years testing a single episode says a lot about how careful public TV had to be, especially when compared to cable channels that could just try things and see what happened. 4 years after filming the pilot, Zoom finally launched for real on January 4th, 1999, under a name WGBH, used internally. Zoom Series 2. The man who created the 1999 show, Christopher Sarson, also made the original 1970 version. When asked what pushed him to make the first show, he simply said he was frustrated. He felt other kids' shows at the time didn't portray real childhood. He pointed to shows like The Partridge Family as an example of that. He carried the same idea into the revival. This time, however, it came with a bigger focus on science and learning, thanks to the funding from the National Science Foundation, plus a whole new way to reach kids through email, home videos, and websites, none of which existed in the 1970s. In short, he didn't build Zoom to feel nostalgic. He built it to test something new. What happens when kids watching a show actually get a way to talk back to it? Bringing the show back was bold, but not as bold as what came after it. The show with 0 adults. Zoom was not the only kids show on television at the time, but it did something other shows didn't dare to attempt. Sesame Street was a kids show, but it still had adults. Mr. Rogers was built around 1 adult. Even the competition shows on Nickelodeon had adults hosting and running things. Zoom had none. Instead, it had 7 kids, somewhere between 8 and 13 years old, running the whole 30 minutes by themselves. There was no host explaining the rules. There was no adult voice at all. The Zoomers, as they were called, introduced each other, ran the games, and spoke to the audience like friends. Diamond Beforgord introduced each other, ran the games, and spoke to the audience like friends. Moyne Decision changed everything about what the show could be. The producers were extremely cautious. They made sure every segment was made simple enough for kids to explain to other kids. That gave the show a completely different feel from anything else on PBS. One cast member from the 3rd and 4th seasons later said the Zoomers were more like peers than teachers. Kids watching at home saw themselves on screen. According to her, only the introductions to each segment were memorized. Everything after that was left open, so the kids could just be themselves. The cast members from the original show said the same thing. Nancy Walker told NPR that being on Zoom let her be curious.
We're going to discuss Do You Need a Maid? And we have with us Jacques Taylor, who runs a maid service, so he should know, and Nancy Walker.
Instead of just reading lines, Joseph Schrand, another original cast member who later became a psychiatrist, called the experience exciting. That feeling stayed the same for so long because the one rule never changed. No adult stood between the kids and the camera. That's also the reason why Zoom never felt like Double Dare or Legend of the Hidden Temple, two shows people often compare it to because they also had kid casts. Those shows were built around competitions with adults running the games. Zoom had ditched adult presence completely. There were no winners or losers, and no prizes. The whole show was a bet that kids could carry live TV by themselves, almost every day of the week. Nobody else was trying that in 1999. To pull that off, they needed to find the right kids first, and that turned into its own operation. Thousands of kids, 7 spots. Because the cast kept changing, WGBH had to run something closer to a talent search than a regular casting office. They opened the auditions to anyone, and thousands of kids showed up. During the second season, more than 2,000 kids came to one audition weekend in Boston. Each kid was given about a minute to show what they could do. They could sing, crack a joke, have a monologue, anything at all. One would expect that number would shrink once word got out that only 7 kids would be picked. But the opposite happened. Later seasons drew even bigger crowds. One audition cycle pulled in almost 3,000 kids, all divided into small groups of 6 in front of 2 casting staff. The point was to keep them relaxed enough to be themselves, instead of freezing up in front of a camera. And before any of them even touched a real camera, the kids who got selected went through a spring training program called Camp Zoom. There, they learned performance skills, learned teamwork, and practiced the science experiments they would be doing on air. Once the producers felt ready, they began filming that summer, 5 days a week, making anywhere from 20 to 40 episodes at a time. According to former cast members, there was a hangout spot on set called the Zoom Zone, where they rehearsed and kept journals the show gave them each season. One interesting thing about the casting was that the contracts for the Zoomers actually prevented them from appearing on TV or in commercials for 3 years after they left the show. That rule made sure the spotlight stayed on the format itself, not on any single kid becoming a star. There was also the issue of diversity, which the producers didn't joke around with. They said they wanted every single cast to include kids from diverse cultures, backgrounds, and ethnicities, and they rebuilt that mix from the ground up every single season. For a kids show reaching the whole country in the late 1990s and early 2000s, doing that every year at that scale wasn't something many other shows would even care about, much less attempting it. But casting the right kids only solved half the problem. Who would write 30 minutes of kids' television 5 days a week? The audience became the writers. Before the revival could even get moving, there was a problem the 1970s version never really had to deal with: the issue of rights. The original Zoom used to cover full songs as a regular part of the show. By 1999, that had to stop because of copyright rules. The media world had gotten a lot stricter since the 70s, so producers had to rework a few segments to stay out of legal trouble. Even though almost all the content came from kids mailing things in, everything still had to pass through lawyers before it could air. And that's one thing that made Zoom stand out from everything else. The content wasn't written by a room of adult writers. It came straight from the audience. Kids all over the country mailed in ideas, games, recipes, science experiments, jokes, short plays. The ones that got picked turned into real segments, and the kid who sent it got credited on air, by name and hometown. Looking at what actually made it to air, it's fair to say PBS was running something close to what we would now call user-generated content, years before that phrase even existed. One could see how deep that pipeline went just by looking at the segments themselves. Zoom Sci ran almost entirely on experiments kids sent in. Cafe Zoom recipes came straight out of kids' kitchens. Zoom Play skits were usually written by viewers too. Even ubby-dubby, the made-up language where people stick ub before every vowel, became something kids used on their own, far beyond just watching the show. Compare that to most children's programming. A lot of shows claim to have kid-written content, but what they really mean is a 5-minute fan mail segment tacked onto something that's otherwise fully scripted by adults. On Zoom, the audience didn't just write a segment. Their writing was the entire production model. Take that pipeline away, and there's simply no show left to fill the runtime. Viewers can see it even in the small stuff. One single week of Season 1 covered a straw and clay tower, a cardboard boat, a lesson on caring for potted plants pulled from a viewer's letter, a tie-dye demo, and a segment with a 13-year-old guest showing the Zoomers what a powwow back home looked like. None of that came out of a writer's room. It came out of an envelope or an email from a kid who just wanted to show the country something they already knew how to do.
And they're writing and acting and producing. It's this kind of involvement.
That same setup also decided how deep the show's topics could go, because the material came straight from real kids talking about their real lives. The Z-mail and conversation segments sometimes touched on things well beyond crafts and games, like prejudice or dealing with a hospital stay. The clearest example came right after September 11th, when Zoom aired a special called America's Kids Remember. Former Zoomers came back to sit with the current cast and talk about how that day affected them and the country. A regular writer's room for other shows would have had to sit and decide first whether something like that belonged on a kids' show. Zoom never had to make that call. The audience already made it just by what they were sending in for that episode. For years, that format worked better than anyone expected. Then it stopped working at all. Why the formula didn't last long? For a while, the bet paid off, and Zoom's ratings were so strong that PBS moved it into its own dedicated PBS Kids Time slot partway through the very first season. By the time they stopped airing reruns in 2007, the show had aired on 269 public TV stations and reached about 4 million kids per week. That may be normal for other shows, but this was a big number for a publicly funded show that ran on a decades-old format and had a cast made up entirely of regular kids. But that didn't last for long. WGBH wrapped up filming for the 7th and final season in 2004, and the last episode aired in May 2005. Kate Taylor, the executive producer, gave the Boston Globe a simple reason why it ended. She said the competition kept putting out new shows. That sounds almost too simple, but it says a lot about where the format hit its limit. Recall that the show needed 2 whole years just to test one pilot episode. Something like that was never going to keep up with cable channels that could greenlight or cancel a show in a fraction of that time. So it turned out the same setup that let Zoom take the risk of pulling adults off screen also made it slow to react the moment faster. Shows started stealing its audience. That wasn't the only limit, however. There was another challenge written deep into the idea of letting viewers write the show. It goes without saying that a show that depends on kids mailing in recipes and experiments can only grow as fast as what actually comes in the mail. It was cheap and fascinating when it was new, but there was no obvious way to raise the stakes. If it was a scripted show, they could just add a bigger budget or a bigger twist to get around that challenge. But Zoom wasn't the same as other shows. So the show's decline wasn't about one bad season. It was a format built for a slower media world running straight into a much faster one. Money played its own part too. Segments like Zoom Sci existed only because the National Science Foundation was paying for the show's educational content. This meant the format wasn't purely a creative choice. It was partly tied to keeping that grant money coming in. A scripted show funded by ads never had to explain its lineup to a government science agency. The relationship with the foundation gave Zoom steady funding early on, but it also meant the show was never fully free to change on its own terms, the way a ratings-driven network show could. The show ended, but that wasn't even the strangest part of this story. The show that disappeared overnight. Here's the strangest part of this whole story, and it's the part most people looking back in retrospect skip. A show that once had massive ratings and reached 4 million kids a week almost vanished completely. WGBH put a lot of effort into the revival, but they failed to give it a real home video or streaming release. All they did was 4 VHS tapes between 1999 and 2002. So the moment PBS Kids stopped airing reruns around 2007, the show just stopped being available anywhere. TV Tropes even mentioned that the show became known among old fans for how hard it was to find online, since it never got the kind of re-release that shows like Sesame Street got. So why did it happen that way? Known. Part of the reason comes down to rights. The music and broadcast licenses that were cleared for TV don't automatically cover home video, streaming, or YouTube. If the producers wanted to go back and clear those rights for a 7-season, 200-plus episode show, they would spend a fortune. So fans spent years hunting down old VHS recordings and uploading missing episodes themselves. Even now, a few episodes from Season 1 are still missing. It wasn't until the show's 50th anniversary that GBH finally digitized and released over 100 episodes through the American Archive of American Broadcasting, along with new interviews with the original cast and Sarson himself. Before the anniversary, much of the show was literally lost. The gap was felt among the cast too. Pablo Velez Jr., one of the original 7 Zoomers from 1999, later said in an interview,
Then we got Pablo Velez Jr., age 39, who was always easily recognized by the orange stripe across his shirt.
that being on the show changed the whole direction of his life. But he also said that looking for work as an adult after that kind of childhood fame could feel isolating. He talked about losing his castmate Jared Nathan, who was on the show's first season and died in a car accident in 2006. Pablo eventually found his way back into public media as an adult, something he described as coming full circle. For a show built on turning ordinary kids' mail into national TV, it's strange how little of that same spotlight followed the kids once the cameras stopped rolling. A show built entirely around giving its audience a direct line into the broadcast, crediting them by name, reading their letters, cooking their recipes, ended up spending about 20 years making it almost impossible for that same audience to find it once it went off the air. The very thing that made Zoom different while it was running is what made it so hard to hold on to once it wasn't. And once you know all of that, the show doesn't look like a fun relic anymore. The part most people miss. Whenever Zoom shows up in a nostalgia video today, it's almost always framed as a fun little relic. Ubby Dubby, the mailing address jingle, a cast of kids doing science experiments in regular clothes instead of the striped shirts from the 70s version. But that framing leaves out one thing. Zoom was PBS running a real experiment in who actually gets to make television at a time when almost every other network still treated its audience as people to watch the show, not people to help build it. The show didn't just put kids on screen like other shows did, it practically handed them the entire production. The people supplying the material were kids. The performers were kids. And every kid who mailed in an idea would get to watch their own recipe or joke read back to them on national TV, with their name attached. That's a lot closer to what social media would eventually build around user posts, except Zoom was doing it through a Boston P.O. box in 1999. Its direct successor, Fetch, with Ruff Ruffman, pushed the educational side even further and became more commercially known, but it moved back towards something more familiar, a proper competition format with a much more adult-built structure around the kid contestants. Nobody ever really built another major kids show around Zoom's exact idea again. Zoom wasn't just some show people happened to grow up with. It was PBS testing, and mostly proving, that you could hand an audience the wheel of a live TV show almost every single day. Why do you think no network has ever picked that exact formula back up? And which show today comes closest to handing its audience that much control? Share your thoughts with us in the comment section. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the next video showing on your screen. You will enjoy it.